Good morning and welcome to the 7th meeting of 2025 of the Scottish Parliament Corporate Bodies Supported Bodies Landscape Review Committee. I have received no apologies for today's meeting. The first item on the agenda is a decision on whether to take item 3 in private. Colleagues, do we agree? Thank you. I now move on to agenda item 2. And today the committee will take evidence from academics and researchers. And I'm very pleased and grateful to welcome to the committee this morning Dr. Ian Elliott, Senior Lecturer in Public Administration at the University of Glasgow. Thank you for being here. Dr. Matthew Gill, Programme Director at the Institute of Government, and thank you for joining us down the line. Dr. Ruth Lamont, Reader in Child and Family Law at the University of Manchester, and also UKRI Thematic Research Lead at the UK Parliament. Welcome and thanks for being here. And also Alison Payne, Research Director at Reform Scotland. Thank you for being here as well, Alison. And also grateful to you all for your written submissions. We move directly to questions. And the first one is from myself, and it's quite a generic one, which is there anything that you would like to relay and emphasise about what you think the purpose of the Scottish Parliament Corporate Bodies Supported Body Commissioners to be or should be? And it's quite a wide question, so who wants to take that first? Perhaps Dr. Elliott, if that's okay.
So for me, I think a key purpose is to support the Parliament with scrutiny around particular policy areas and to provide both a long-term perspective but also significant expertise in areas that may be fairly technical or legalistic. I'm thinking, a classic example being the Human Rights Commissioner, where they can provide, particular expertise. Also, I think that long-term view. I think having a commissioner that is, appointed, that works over a period of time and develops skills and expertise within a particular area gives real advantage. And I think the independence of the commissioners is also something that's quite important within that, particularly in a unicameral system like we have here, where they can give that independent and unbiased view on aspects of policy. So the scrutiny role, but also that expertise and that long-term role, I think, is really valuable for the Parliament to have, to be able to draw on.
And are there any particular examples that stand out for you in that regard, or?
I mean, I think I don't want to kind of say that one commissioner is better than the other or anything like that. I don't want to kind of, have favourites.
Yeah.
But I think you can see from the commissioners that already exist that there are, areas of particular expertise. And again, I did mention the Human Rights Commissioner, but also the Scottish Information Commissioner, I think, has a really crucial and valuable role to play in supporting the Parliament. So that would be, my view in terms of the purpose of commissioners and the value that they bring.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Elliott. And Dr. Lamont, do you want to?
Thank you.
Pick up on that?
I have more expertise around the English system, but I can provide you with an insight into the comparator bodies. I think I would support your point about scrutiny. Because commissioners can design their own process of research and engagement with the constituency that they represent, they can provide that long-term view. You also in Scotland have commissioners that have comparable bodies that are important globally. So the one I'm thinking of is the Children's Commissioner in particular. There's a Children's Commissioner in each of the 4 nations, but there's also Children's Commissioners or equivalent ombudsmen across the European space and more globally. And I would also agree with the point about the Information Commissioner. So where a commissioner has a particular framework to work with and enforce, they provide an environment in which that can be done and supported in an appropriate way. And they can put out information and they can provide information to constituents that it's difficult for government to do otherwise effectively. The question of what they should be is a much broader one. And what I think, and I'm really amazed and impressed that the Scottish Parliament is looking at this question, because nobody else has, is what are you trying to achieve with this? Are you trying to provide an environment in which there is a body that helps enforce complicated frameworks like human rights and data protection? Or are you providing representation for a constituency that otherwise struggles to have traction in a particular framework? So I'm thinking here of victims and witnesses commissioners who don't have those frameworks, but they represent those interests at a higher level. So that's, I guess, the should question for me. Thank you.
It's really interesting and helpful. And look, I'll just bring in shortly, Lorna, if that's okay. Dr. Gill, do you want to give us your thoughts now, please? Thanks.
Yeah, sure. So I think it's, in a way, stepping back from this, your challenge is almost to try and identify when you should not have a commissioner or body, and you want to sort of define that set of what they're for as narrowly as possible. I think the Human Rights Commissioner, the Information Commissioner, one could argue that it's the independence from the machinery of government and to some extent the parliamentarians themselves that's quite important in the way that they do their work and look at some of these issues. And I think I'd agree that giving a voice to underrepresented groups in policy debates is quite important. That's why you might want a particular sort of representative in there. And I think the reason I try and set it out narrowly is that in almost any policy debate, there could be a role for experts and bringing experts to give witness to you. And so you need, I think, criteria beyond that to say, well, when is the threshold above which it's not just about calling expert witnesses or recruiting experts into government to be able to do a thing well. We actually need a commissioner for a certain degree of independence or a certain degree of advocacy of people who would not otherwise be represented in the policy debate to make it worth setting up this particular kind of office. And then I think being clear about how that role differs from that of a regulator or indeed of a political representative. And I think there are a couple of things in that context it's worth thinking about that you might say that commissioners are not for, and you might say they're not to do time-limited things because that would be more of what you might use an inquiry for, not to hold government to account in a general sense, in the sense that that's the role of the Scottish Parliament. So thinking about, well, whether is there a specific role that a commissioner has above and beyond the general scrutiny and holding to account that you perform. I think trying to draw a distinction between bringing unrepresentative groups into the policy debate or underrepresented groups into the policy debate versus going so far as championing a cause. It may not be the role of a commissioner established by government to do that. And obviously the final one would be not to set them up just to sort of demonstrate the importance of an issue or that action is being taken on an issue. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Again, very helpful and just really good context for the rest of our discussion. Alison Payne, please.
I think we would sort of separate out the sort of the advocacy and the integrity bodies and look at them differently. I think the integrity bodies are vital. I think they are important in terms of the transparency, the accountability, holding government and parliament to account. And I think it's that sort of element of holding the broader democracy to account. I think the advocacy roles bring up a different question. I think the children and young people one is slightly different. I think we mentioned in our evidence that they are an underrepresented group. They are a group that aren't part of the electorate. And that's different, and it's ensuring that voice is heard. I think there is a danger that if one underrepresented group gets an advocate, where do you draw the line? There are an awful lot of underrepresented groups. Do you have job seekers, for example, or those who are different minorities, different people struggling to get in? I think there is a broader question as to if there are an awful lot of underrepresented groups in terms of policy making, is that more of a failure in terms of Parliament and what is going on and how those voices aren't being heard? And I think rather than it can be seen to be a great win, as has been mentioned by others, that, you know, it's an easy win, you create a commissioner. But is that actually doing what is necessary? Are we then, you know, hearing the views? And I think in the broader context, obviously part of the reason for having this discussion is about the financial implications. We've seen a lot of the kind of third sector advocacy groups are getting their budgets cut because of local government and cuts and things that are happening elsewhere. There does seem to be a sort of an imbalance of creating an SPCB advocate when third sector groups that are out there on the ground trying to deliver for these individuals are seeing their budgets cut. So I think from our mind, we would want to look at the bodies in two separate things, that there are two different roles, and what we would say about the broader issues would differ depending which one you were looking at.
Thank you. Again, very helpful for our discussion going forward. And to start that, Lorna Slater, you wanted to...
Sort of just a supplemental, convener, although I'm interested in the points around the separation out by advocacy and integrity, so I'm sure I'll come back to that later. But following up really on what Dr. Lamont said, although everyone alluded to it, I guess one of the challenges I think we have in the advocacy space is that a new advocacy body represents a failure of existing bodies, and it isn't clear that a new body is going to succeed where all the others have not, because really the success or not of an advocacy body, whether they are a commissioner or something else, is to do with their level of influence, whether the government, because the other point is the success is how well the government listens to them. And one of the challenges I have around, for example, the proposal of a future generations commissioner, whose purpose, of course, I support, is what would make the government listen to them when they don't listen to any of the environmental NGOs or politicians that speak on those topics? Why would they listen to them? So I guess I have that challenge as well, is that does creating a commissioner solve either of those problems? Is there evidence that they have more influence?
Who wants to take that? Dr. Lamont.
I'm happy to take the first ball. So I think that is a very interesting question because it is focused on the relationship of the Commissioner with government. And the relationship between the Commissioner and the particular policy space is not just about the question of the government, it's a wider context. So you are talking about, say, I'm going to take the examples of victims and witnesses because that's the one I know most about. A victims commissioner operates in a very complicated criminal justice environment, and it's not just about government. So you're talking about relationships with police services in England and Wales with the Crown Prosecution Service, and it's a representative role outside of just that relationship with government. So in that sense, it can provide a broader advocacy and an overarching perspective on the status of victims. You're also talking about environments where I was really struck by the point you made about children's commissioners. They represent people who don't vote. In something like in relation to victims, they are essential to the prosecution process, but they have no status in that process. So is the Commissioner there to provide that perspective? But the question of whether they can succeed where other bodies are not able to, I think very much depends on the receptiveness to critique, the relationship they have with government, but also those broader bodies, and to an extent the personality of the Commissioner. You know, you mentioned the future generations. I could take that as a child and family lawyer in 3 different directions quite easily. It's a huge brief. So you're going to get, it's that risk that was pointed to, that you might get that sense of campaigning rather than advocacy.
Really?
Yeah.
Dr. Elliott, did you want to come in on that, and then I'll bring in Dr. Gill?
Yeah, thank you. I think there's also a risk with some of these bodies of an overlap in their actual remit. So the Victims Commissioner has been mentioned. You know, to what extent does that overlap with, for example, human rights? I'm not clear on that, and I know in some of the evidence that was provided to the committee, there's also comments about overlaps between human rights, disability commissioner, even children's commissioner. You mentioned the potential future generations commissioner. There's been mention of that potentially overlapping with the children's commissioner and a potential wellbeing and sustainability commissioner. So I think with all of these groups, particularly when you get into the advocacy space, there's a risk of overlaps with some of the integrity commissioners, if we want to call them that. So I think that distinguishing those 2 different groups is really, really helpful. But at the same time, I wouldn't necessarily say that an integrity body doesn't have an advocacy role as well in terms of looking at particular groups, because of course the Human Rights Commissioner should be thinking about human rights in relation to children. You know, so you know, there can be an important role for an integrity body to advocate for underrepresented groups. But I was really struck by what Dr. Gill said about groups that are not otherwise represented in the policy debate, and that's a real concern. And I don't think we can solve that by creating additional commissioners. I think there's a question for the Parliament itself to ask: why are we raising the question right now that we have groups in society that are underrepresented by this Parliament? Are we okay with that? And do we really think that the answer to that is to create separate bodies for children? You know, why are children not represented already in this Parliament? Why are older people not represented? Why are disabled people not represented? Why are victims not represented by this Parliament already? That's quite a serious indictment of, you know, devolution, frankly, and the role of this Parliament. I think, you know, we need to ask serious questions about where the failure is coming from, and trying to solve that at source, rather than almost kind of outsourcing that problem to another body. I don't really think that is the solution to the issues that have been identified.
Very interesting points. I mean, the question of the utilisation of MSP time and resources is a broad one, but one that this committee has touched on, and I think your remarks there are very, very interesting and helpful. Dr. Gill, you wanted to come in as well?
Yeah, I mean, I'm taking the question as, you know, when something is not working properly, how do we know that setting up this new body is actually going to work to solve the problem? And I think I'd agree with Ian that the first thing to do is to look at the existing structures and see if they can be made to work better. And that might be looking at the personnel, the funding, the powers and remits of the existing structures. But I think if you do decide that a commissioner is required, as well as everything that's been said about the influence of the individual and the willingness of government to listen. You can also think about the powers that you give to that commissioner. So, for instance, the power to gather data, make it public, to require people to give evidence to it, and to make recommendations that the government or has to respond to can give them a kind of traction that, for instance, a charitable body couldn't have.
Thank you. Again, really interesting.
Can I
and
just
further
come
context.
quickly on the
Alison
back
Payne.
of that? I mean, what Dr. Gillett outlined there. There's the committee system as well. I mean, the broader parliamentary committee system that can compel witnesses, that can, work with a whole range of different advocates, whether the third sector or others. I think that is part of that, looking at the broader why is democracy not working and ensuring these voices are heard. It does need to then link back to the committee system that can work really well, but there have been suggestions about how to improve the Scottish Parliament's committee system that have been talked about an awful lot, and nothing's ever actually changed about that. So that's maybe something that, we should be, the committee system is there to be an advocate in those specific areas. That's maybe something to bear in mind as part of that broader discussion.
Absolutely, absolutely. Lorna Slater, did you want to add any further?
No,
or
that's...
move to,
sorry,
move
thank
to
you.
colleagues. Okay, thank you. Murdo Fraser, would you like to comment there?
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning, panel. Alison Payne reminds me Reform Scotland wrote an excellent paper last year on parliamentary reform. I can't quite remember who wrote that, but I commend it to colleagues. Come back to the issue I want to pursue is looking at the criteria. So we already have set criteria for creating new SPCB-supported bodies. And of course, the purpose of this committee is to look at that criteria and see if it's still fit for purpose. So maybe just start by asking all of you, what's your view on the criteria that needs to be set? Is the existing criteria fit for purpose? And if not, how do we ensure that, addressing some of the concerns you've already raised, we're not overlapping functions that could be done by other bodies? I'd like to start. Alison.
I think the criteria is probably not the problem, because you could make a case for any of the current commissioners that have been proposed, or the new ones, or additional ones that might come up. You can make a case using that criteria, but you can make a case for anything. It doesn't mean the criteria is wrong. I think it's some of the needing to take a step back, and actually it's that broader issue. It's the what it is and how those bodies fit into the broader democratic process. Because if there are gaps, it's who's to say, there's obviously an argument as to whether there's a gap, whether there is, whether those needs aren't being met by one of the other bodies. And I think Ian's correct about that kind of the overlap, particularly with like the Human Rights Commission and touching on some of the other areas. But that doesn't mean a case can't be made. And I think part of that thing is it's very difficult to argue against a commissioner. I think that's part of the problem, because if somebody's making a really good case for, say, the patient safety, to argue against it makes you seem like you're against patient safety. And the whole thing, and the sort of the way that the media can be, that then it ends up being a completely separate debate. And actually, I think it's difficult to argue against a commissioner. It's not necessarily around about the criteria. It's that broader issue. And I think it's that kind of having that broader understanding that when we're saying we're against, you can't then come along and you would have to justify, well, we're saying yes to this one and no to this one and no to this one. And I think that's our point about the precedent, that once you get into one advocate, it is very, very difficult, because it doesn't matter whether you change the criteria. Once you have one, how can you say no to another?
Yeah, that's a very fair point, and we heard that from other witnesses we've taken evidence from. In the written submission you've made on behalf of Reform Scotland, you say the criteria hasn't actually been followed. Parliament's just ignored it, which I think is probably a fair comment. I mean, can we produce criteria that actually will be solid enough? I
think the criteria is not the problem. I think it's what you're trying to achieve. And if it's the criteria, you could almost say, it's not particularly detailed. It's vague enough that you can kind of get around it. And yes, I think our broader point about committees publishing, whether it's the 2008 review or the 2006 Financial Committee's report, we'll say these things and then we publish and forget. There's a broader issue around about that, and I think it's taking a step back and saying, what is it we're wanting to achieve? What are the roles? How do these bodies fit into the broader democratic process. And if there's a gap, then yes, there's something there to be created. But I think it's maybe looking at where the gaps exist, why the gaps exist, what Parliament can do to fill those. Because I think, as we say, that you've got 9 MSPs that represent you, you've got your councillors, you've got an MP, you've got a whole host of people. I'm not sure if you were to say to the public that the thing that's missing is you need somebody else representing you. It's like, well, why aren't you fixing the problem? And I think that's sort of, I think this issue that was mentioned in some of the evidence about failures in public policy, you fix the public policy. It's not about trying to find a commissioner, trying to do something round the sides. It's about fixing public policy. If, as part of that attempt to address the problem, something else is identified that would help, then that's different. And I think it's more about looking at each of the specific issues. And if there's a problem that's identified that for some reason where that voice isn't being heard, and I think on the advocacy one, particularly about young people, because their voice isn't part of that broader electorate, then you can see how that fits in. But if it's about older people and there's been a policy failure and older people's voices aren't being heard, that's a failure that needs to be addressed elsewhere. And I think it's going back to the root cause, not trying to kind of develop some sort of sticking plaster.
Dr. Elliott, you're nodding there, not adding anything.
Just completely agree with what's been said, so nothing more to add.
Okay. Can I ask Matthew Gill about this? Because in the report you did, Dr. Gill, in 2023, you proposed 3 new tests for establishing a public body around effectiveness, independence and cost efficiency. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on this and how that interreacts with the current criteria that's been set down by Parliament.
Yeah. So I thought the criteria, looking at them, were helpful, to be honest, but I think they potentially conflate 2 questions. One is whether to set up a new body, and the other is how to do it well. So, for instance, the criteria around shared services or around clarity of remit, those are obviously things you'd want to think about when setting up a body, but aren't necessarily decision criteria at the moment of deciding whether to do so or not. So I think what I would suggest is trying to split out those 2 questions and think really specifically about what determines that initial sort of use case. Now, the 3 tests that you refer to, that research was much broader and was about sort of public bodies in general rather than commissioners. So in a way, what they were trying to do was to distill into short form a business case that one might create for doing something at arm's length from government rather than doing it in government itself, for instance. And so I think in terms of translating that onto the questions that you've got here, the thing that's probably most important is to be thinking about what are the alternative options for achieving the same objective. So the kind of thing I would think about would be, is it essential for these functions to have a Parliament-supported body doing them, or could they be performed somewhere else? Are there any existing bodies that could take on this work? And then look at whether those alternative structures would achieve what you want. I mean, from the conversation that's just happened, yeah, I think some criteria that will come out. Obviously, we've talked about integrity bodies and the specific need for those, the advocacy that maybe they provide, and whether Parliament is for some reason unable to provide that, and trying to make that case, as has been said before, as to why this can't be done by Parliament itself, and therefore sets quite a high bar for having a separate body doing it, and that there would be nobody else doing it in place. I think the other thing that we found in doing some other research we did on parliamentary oversight of regulators in Westminster was that actually mapping what's already there is not straightforward. There isn't necessarily a ready list of all of the bodies that might impinge on a particular space. So I think starting with that is really important as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was the point that David Hamilton, the Information Commissioner, made to us when he came to the committee a few weeks ago, that even he couldn't properly get a handle on how many public bodies there were in Scotland, despite the role his his office has in securing freedom of information. Can I ask you one more follow-up, Dr. Gill? Because, again, going back to your report in 2023 on creating new public bodies, you challenged the idea they should only be created as a last resort. So can you explain what your thinking was behind that?
Simply that if, you know, and it's important to be rigorous in these sort of business cases and analysis, but it is possible. It's really the point that if creating a public body was more effective than trying to do something in a department, for instance, which would have been the counterfactual in this case, then it should be done. And it might be that you have people who have greater technical expertise in a public body. It might be that you're able to plan over a longer time horizon than is usually possible within a department to do something. And so really that's the thrust of it. The last resort framing implies that you would do something in another way, even if that way of doing it was demonstrably worse. And so what I'm arguing is not that one would proliferate public bodies, but that if it can be demonstrated that that's the best way of achieving an outcome, we should not just ideologically prevent ourselves from doing that.
Okay. So we shouldn't just rule out new commissioners just for the sake of it. There might be a case for them.
Exactly, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be very, very sceptical about the business case we're putting forward.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Lamont, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that. I've got one specific question I want to ask about your paper, but before I come to that, have you got any thoughts on that broader question?
Only briefly, I would also agree that you have to distinguish the why are you doing this question from the how do you structure this to do it well. And actually your why question will very much inform how you do it well. So, for example, the Domestic Abuse Commissioner in England and Wales has produced research and has had access to data that is otherwise difficult to access. That's a good outcome. So do you want these bodies to be able to do that kind of research? But that relates back to your why. Could that be done in another way? Yeah. So I would agree with that point. Okay,
thank you. I wanted to ask you about the paper you co-wrote with Pamela Cox and Maurice Sunkin on the case for the Victims Commissioner in England and Wales. Now, it's very relevant because right now this Parliament is discussing a Victims Commissioner for Scotland. I think the convener sits on that committee. I don't, but I think he does. So this is very relevant. So I read that with interest, and what really struck me was your conclusion to that, where forgive me for paraphrasing and correct me if I've got this wrong, but effectively what you're saying is if this new commissioner is not to be given statutory powers, is it really worth having him or her? Do you want to just elaborate a little bit for the benefit of the committee on what your thinking is in reaching that conclusion?
Okay, so that research that's referred to was completed with Pamela Cox and Maurice Sunkin at Essex and originated from work we did with the Victims Commissioner's Office. And that office was participating in the development of what was intended to be a victims law in England and Wales. And they were interested in the comparable powers of commissioners because there is no single framework for a commissioner. And I suppose that relates back to the why are you doing this? If you consider the why, then it gives you a certain, in theory, series of powers that you have to achieve. We reached that conclusion around the Victims Commissioner because the risk of creating a body that purports to represent and advocate and have a stake that then is not well known, has very few powers, doesn't have a stake in government or other conversations, is that actually it's a chimera. It's actually going to undermine trust in that process. So are you not better in a very complex regulatory framework, which is the point you made about public bodies, saying, okay, we need to look for true accountability elsewhere?
So, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but we're trying to extrapolate from your research some lessons for us. Essentially, is it the case that you're saying that someone with a purely advocacy role is of limited value?
I'm not saying that advocacy is of limited value. And I think the Victims Commissioner role, as I alluded to before, is not just about the relationship with government. It's also about victims within the criminal justice system. So that broader conversation about how it interrelates with prosecution and prosecution agencies, policing agencies. It has a kind of broader status. But unless you give the advocate the powers to articulate and argue that on a consistent basis, have a public status and a role within that structure, it's not going to carry out its purpose.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm conscious, Dr. Lamont, that your examination, which was very helpful to and interesting to hear you elaborate on there, is regard to the situation in England and Wales. And of course we have the proposition of a Victims Commissioner before our Parliament at present. Indeed, at stage 2 out of our 3 stages, last week at the Criminal Justice Committee, amendments were tabled on the bill on this matter. And I'm sure if you had capacity and wanted to, if there was any insight or examination that you wanted to provide to Parliament on that bill as now amended, I'm sure that would be of interest to a number of MSPs.
Yeah, we were really aware of that bill. We returned evidence when it first entered the Scottish Parliament because structurally it was stronger in terms of powers than the comparable Victims Commissioner in England and Wales. So I'd be happy to help if there's anything we can add there in terms of our
thinking particularly
experience.
with regard to now it having been amended further at stage 2 just last week.
Yeah.
I have to be conscious here that I sit on that committee too, and you know, our job here today is to talk broadly and not about one proposition in particular. But that was really interesting and helpful, and I just thought it was also important to give that wider context. So,
thank you.
But yeah, if there's anything that you were interested to and able to follow up on, I'm sure Parliament would be interested in that ahead of stage 3, and given what you've said today with regard to the remit and task that this committee is undertaking. So thank you very much. I'm now going to move to Lorna Slater, who has, I think, a follow-up question with regard to what we've just discussed, and then just go on to your other questions, please, Laura.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Convener. Yeah, sort of a follow-up question around the point on trust. Now, it's my impression from the sort of media and stuff that trust in governments and institutions is at an all-time low anyway. So what I think I'm hearing from you saying there is, I guess what we've heard from other witnesses in this process is that independence is the key thing for trust. It has to be independent. It has to be independent. That's what everybody says. So I've got 2 questions around that. One is, an SPC-supported body is one way in which bodies can be independent. Is it the best? Are there other ways to be independent? And is that true, that independence is the route to trust? Because Dr. Lamont, you seem to be suggesting that effectiveness was a better route to trust. But I'm interested in people's thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about, I think part of it is, so I think we mentioned in our evidence, our Commission on School Reform has called for an advocacy when looking at educational data. And I was just thinking about the part of that was because of the independence. And if you think of the recent, say, school leavers discussions about the statistics that came out in school leavers, and it descends to an argument about stats. And one side says it's brilliant, the other side says it's awful, and the public is completely in the dark because it doesn't have a clue. And I think the independence of some of those integrity bodies is so vital because it's saying this is trustworthy. And being able to call out and sort of say that, you know, when you get locked into that kind of battle, that everybody kind of finds their point. I think it's really important to have a kind of an independent body, whether it's looking at the standards or looking at the ethical one of the human rights. But somebody is independent and it can't be accused of whether it's to do with the Constitution or any other areas where our politics gets into binaries. Having somebody who's independent of that. In saying that, I think there are other bodies like Audit Scotland who have that level of independence and are crucial in terms of our accountability and our democracy. But the independence is crucial because I think, particularly at the moment, everything is in binary form when it comes to discussions. And so having something that's separate from that can say, no, this, you know, provide that level of independence, whether it's through the media and to others, that you can say this is trustworthy. And I think that is particularly important at the moment.
And that would be with respect to these sort of integrity bodies, I suppose. Maybe that's slightly different when it comes to the advocacy bodies, or?
Sorry, did you want to follow up? No. You raise a really interesting question. So independence has been raised a few times, and so these bodies have been referred to as independent and also as at arm's length. And there's a distinction between those two categories. And there was some research done in the early 2000s about criminal justice inspectorates. So slightly different purpose, inspecting criminal, like police and police performance and things like that. So the question of independence is a very difficult one because a commissioner is funded by government and their access is determined by government, and they are usually part of a ministerial portfolio in Westminster. So to what extent are they actually independent? So there's that question of, like, something independent would be separately funded. The point that you make about NGOs and third sector, that's independent. These are at arm's length. So there is a kind of mixture of concepts there. Independence can bring trust, but in the advocacy space, it can also bring, as you point to, one particular perspective, because true independence is the ability to say exactly what you wish. And these are political appointments. So to what extent are they going to challenge the government that appointed them and their policy framework, or are they going to run with the general frame? So I think the question of independence is quite complicated there. And it also, independence is not necessarily about trust. People can't perceive independence. How do you determine that? What people are interested in is, can this body give me what I need? Can this body represent my interests where I have been ignored to this point? Or I don't have a status in these proceedings? Or whatever the particular context is. They're not particularly bothered about our concerns about who funds it and when are they appointed and what are their powers. They're bothered about, can they do the job for me? Mm-hmm. And that, for me, is where trust is built. You know, are these processes effective?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with what Dr. Lamont has said completely there. I think one of the values of the Parliamentary Commissioner function, which is obviously the focus of this inquiry, is the fact that they are sponsored by the Parliament as opposed to government, and that does give that independence, and they are apolitical in that sense. It's a really valuable point to raise, I think, partly because the scope of this inquiry is very much on the Parliamentary Commissioners, but I think it's important to recognise that there are many bodies that have Commission or Commissioner in the title, and it does create a lot of confusion about what is a Commissioner. I think there's about 16 bodies that we're not looking at that are commissions or commissioners. But it's very, very hard to find information about this very complex landscape. It's a very big question, you know, independence and trust in government. Sorry. Yes.
I don't want you to lose your thoughts there, so please do come back on those points with Lawrence later. But just, I think the point you made there about us as a committee, in terms of looking at the SPCB bodies, we're only looking at part of a bigger picture. And do you think that is something really important for Parliament to bear in mind and for us to consider as we conclude in the months ahead?
Yes, I've mentioned it previously that, you know, I think if you're going to look at commissioners, it's important to look at that in the broadest sense, because there are many different models. We're only looking at the parliamentary commissioners here, which is a very valuable exercise, particularly given the numbers that are being suggested. But we shouldn't ignore the fact that there are many, many more bodies within Scotland that are sponsored by government, that have a commissioner function of sorts. But we're not looking at those here. But I think that is something to bear in mind and at least be cognizant of in these discussions.
Thank you.
But to come back to Lorna's question about independence and trust in government, it's a nice, easy question, isn't it? I mean, you know, the issue of trust in government is obviously very, very complex. I think independence of parliamentary commissioners does help, notwithstanding the fact that who even knows what a commissioner is and whether it's a parliamentary commissioner or not leads to some degree of confusion. I think there's another couple of characteristics that I think are quite important for us to consider. One is expertise and one is visibility. So, you know, if you think about, again, you know, the Information Commissioner, you know, that's a body that's been around for a very long time. It has a quite high profile. And so I think that does lead to a sense of trust in that body. I feel as though the more commissioners you create, the more you can potentially dilute the sense of these being trusted organisations. My argument has always been that it would be better to have fewer parliamentary commissioners but larger commissioners with larger remits and more powers than have fewer with more dispersed powers and overlaps in their function. That's a way of diluting the commissioner system and weakening, I think, their position. If we really want to have a very strong level of scrutiny and independence, then we should be thinking, you know, if we're thinking about whether to develop a new parliamentary commissioner, my view would be the first question should be, is there an existing body that could already perform this function? Is there an existing commissioner that could, you know, could absorb this function, perhaps with more resource, perhaps with more powers? Because we should be strengthening the existing system rather than trying to dilute it by creating lots of different ones, potentially with conflicting remits.
Brilliant. I've got a few more questions on that. Oh, sorry, Dr. Gill.
Yeah, sorry, just to come back on that, I think lots of interesting points have been made. I think would express some scepticism about whether a lack of public trust is in itself a reason to establish a body. I think because if we go back to the previous conversation about what the criteria are for setting one up, if you were to put lack of public trust on that list, you would end up with a very large list of bodies. So I think if there is lack of public trust in something, I would say look at how that can be fixed. Is it through parliamentary engagement? Is it through transparency of that service? Is it just improving performance? And then turn to a particular body of this kind only if the problem cannot be fixed, and not only can it not be fixed? But the solution appears systematically, or for systematic reasons, to be that there needs to be this kind of commissioner overseeing it and exercising a specific set of powers to solve the problem. So I think that's really quite a high bar, and I wouldn't start from public trust as one of the criteria.
And as Dr. Elliott has suggested, creating more commissioners may, in fact, undermine that intention inadvertently. Sort of on a similar theme, among the things that we've discussed, so we've separated in this conversation this morning the difference between advocacy and integrity commissioners. In terms of the work that they do, we've thought in this committee a lot about work that is preventative and work that is reactive. So, some of the research that the Ombudsman does, that kind of thing, some of the research that the Human Rights Commissioner does, versus when it's a casework problem. Something has gone wrong in the hospital, the prison, my school. Who do I go to? And one of my concerns with this sort of proliferation of these bodies is who do you go to? And we heard very effective pitches for various commissioners last week, an older person's commissioner, people neurodivergent commissioner, but you of course can be many of those things, and therefore where do you go? In defence of their remits, existing office holders and advocates have said, but we're very good about handing people between, we're very good about signposting. I wonder whether you had a view on whether a sort of one-stop shop, maybe, Dr. Elliott, you were sitting a larger group with a wider remit, so that if something has gone wrong, whether it was in a school, a prison, a hospital, you go to one place and you will be looked after. Any views on that, Alison?
Isn't that the job of the MSPs? I mean, one of the things I was thinking that, obviously, because each constituent has 9 MSPs, sometimes and I think there's an important job in terms of the Standards Commissioner and being able to kind of address where there's been a failing, but there's 9 options. So if and so surely it should be the job that if you have a problem with your school, with your hospital, you go to your MSP. And then the MSPs then should be able to have an idea of if there's particular issues in particular areas and building on that. But to my mind, the one-stop shop is the MSP. And I would be interested in terms of, I can see where an MSP would direct somebody to the Information Commissioner, the Human Rights Commissioner, some of those more integrity ones, and kind of working with them. But it would seem odd that an MSP couldn't help. Is there something that an MSP can't help a constituent with that requires that additional commissioner, that advocate, and the advocacy role? Because to my mind, I think you confuse that. It should be very clear to the public that if you need help in something, your MSP should be the first place. Now, we already know that there's confusion in terms of the lines of accountability, what is from Westminster, Holyrood or the council. I think there's a danger of then over-confusing things, as saying, well, it's not always will it be your MSP, it should be this person, it should be that person. To my mind, we have a one-stop shop. It should be your politician. That's your level of accountability and the democratic process.
Any other thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think it's helpful to think about groups who might not feel comfortable or able to approach their MSP. I'm wondering if that in part is where the Victims Commissioner might fall. And if someone feels that they've been, that they have suffered personally because of the state generally, might they be concerned about approaching an MSP? Or indeed, I know there's discussions in the UK government at the moment about potentially developing a commissioner for whistleblowers. If you were a whistleblower within the public sector, might you fear, approaching an MSP about that problem, and therefore might there be a role for a separate body? So it might be helpful to think about, that potential conflicts of interest and what might stop someone from approaching an MSP. Are there legitimate reasons why someone would feel that they need a completely separate independent body that they can contact to raise their concerns, or particularly if they've been the victim of something that has happened by the state itself? So that's maybe something to think about.
Any other thoughts on that point before I move on?
I mean, just to say that obviously a lot of the commissioners will know where their areas overlap, and so should be good at cross-referring people who've approached the wrong place initially. I was just going to reflect on the discussion we've been having about advocacy versus integrity as well. I think conceptually, if that goes into the sort of criteria you subsequently develop, it's probably worth thinking a little bit about the word advocacy and whether that really captures the role that's wanted for these bodies. It's maybe somewhere between or towards representative of interest in a balanced process rather than a kind of advocacy which is seeking preference, if you like.
No, I think that's fair. I think we've struggled all along to try and find the right language around this because, and because there is substantial overlap where where different officers are concerned. In terms of, I don't think there's any. I'll ask this one quickly, but I assume there's no issues there. Problems with imagining that parliamentary supported commissioners should share back office services, HR. That no problems with that kind of thing. Dr. Elliott, you mentioned this, and it's something that's on our minds too, as the convener said, that the remit of this committee is specifically to look at the SPCB supported body commissioners, but we are aware that there is a wider landscape of public bodies, third sector organisations, and other commissioners of various flavours that exist there. Do you have a feel for how much time and resource it might take to map that out? So we know we haven't got the time and resource to do that. How big of a job is that if someone were to take that on?
Are you talking about all public bodies?
Well, to properly understand the landscape here, because I think we're all worried about gaps. We're worried about a system that isn't working well. Yeah, what kind of resource would that take?
It's a very hard question. I'm honestly not sure, without giving that a bit more thought, how much time it would take to map out the landscape right now. All I can say is, in preparation for this meeting, I did try to find a definitive list of the number of bodies with the word commission or commissioner, and I did find it quite difficult to find exactly how many there are, or indeed how many still are operating, how many have ceased to exist, who is the lead within the different organisations, what their remit is. Some of them seem to be very active. Some of them seem to have very strong public presence. Others, it looks as though it's maybe just one person on a kind of part-time basis. It's incredibly difficult for the public to know how many commissioner bodies there are and how one differs from another. I mean, presumably somebody has this information. I would like to think so, but certainly it does seem like a very messy landscape that has developed organically over time. And of course, with this meeting as well, we're talking about potential new commissioners. Ultimately, there's nothing stopping the government from deciding to create their own commissioner bodies, and we could have all of the ones that are being proposed being developed in a completely different format, still with the name commissioner in the title, and the public wouldn't necessarily be any the wiser about that.
And a final question for me, which I can direct to Dr. Elliott, but others may have view. Dr. Deal may have a view as well. You can see the problem that's before us in terms of the SPCB supported bodies. What steps could be taken to make a more coherent view? Because we're even having trouble defining them into categories or groups because there's so much kind of messy overlap. What would a more coherent model look like, do you think?
Well, I was really struck by what the evidence that was provided by the Biometrics Commissioner about this hub and spoke model. I think, and you mentioned already this idea of a kind of one-stop shop. I think there is real value in having one central place that people can go and then, be directed towards the right person to speak to. I think that would have real value for the commissioners themselves as well, in terms of supporting the development of their own expertise and sharing knowledge and expertise across the different commissioner bodies. So I think that has real value. I know there was quite a lot of research conducted. I think it was possibly 2010. So some of my other colleagues might know better than I, within the UK government and within the Scottish Parliament itself around the commissioner landscape. Undoubtedly, there is a need for a refresh of some of that, because so many of these things have changed since. But I think I'll have to come back to you about how much time that might take to actually do that. Put me on the spot there. I'm not really sure. But again, some of my colleagues might have a clearer view on how much time it would take to conduct that type of research.
Brilliant. Thank you. Anyone else with comments on those questions? Yeah, Dr. Gill?
Yeah. I mean, I think in terms of getting a grip on this, I would put a lot of emphasis on that process of really defining very precisely the criteria for when you would want to set up this kind of body rather than something else. So the why of that kind of why and how in the criteria that we described earlier. We've had a bit of a discussion today on some of the substance of that, but I think there's quite a bit more thinking to do on it. And I mean, we talked a little bit about the last resort criterion, which we argued against applying to public bodies in general, but the SPCB bodies are very much a subset of those which are being established because it has not been possible to do something through other means in the public sector. And so I think something like a last resort criteria or a very high bar to show that alternatives have been seriously looked at looks more appropriate in this case than it does on the public bodies landscape as a whole.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks very much. If there's no further comments on those matters, I'll turn to Richard Leonard now, please. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot and good morning. I think I'm interested to find out your views on language, because how interchangeable are some of the terms which are used in the discussion about what purpose these different commissions and commissioners fulfil. So typically when we started this exercise, we were told there are those who are regulatory and those that are advocacy commissions. Alison Payne, you talk about advocacy and integrity commissions and commissioners. Ruth Lamont, you talk about regulatory commissions, but you also talk about contested social needs commissioners and special interest commissioners. Dr. Elliott, you talk about developing a strategic state, which is kind of what you've alluded to already. Are these interchangeable terms, or do they represent different profiles of different commissioners, different powers of different commissioners, different purposes of different commissioners? Alison Payne, do you want to start?
Sure. I think regulatory integrity, I think from our point of view, it was more sort of an interchangeable, but trying to distinguish between those that are advocacy, and I think that's more on that kind of side, and the others which we see as being more intrinsic to ensuring the good practice of democracy and the workings of Parliament, and maintaining accountability and transparency, and those side of things that kind of work alongside Parliament, but you can't see necessarily being able to be done elsewhere. It's not going to be you couldn't have a third sector organisation being the information commissioner, for example. There's a separate role in it, and it's needed and it's important, and so I think that sort of those groupings are called, I think, was less of an issue to us. It was more about separating out the two, because in terms of how we looked at it, we viewed them differently in terms of what the potential solutions might be.
And are you fairly clear which commissions and commissioners you put into each of those two categories? Because I'm not sure that they're clear themselves when we've asked them how they define themselves.
I think certainly I would say that most of the ones that are coming up are being suggested, or in patient safety, victims, witnesses, disability, older people, well-being, are all more on the advocacy side. I think it's interesting that some of the more original ones about the Information Commissioner, the standards, human rights, are more kind of, more part of those kind of ensuring that Parliament is working in and helping it maintain that, the independence and the transparency. There are obviously overlaps, I think, as Dr. Elliott mentioned. Clearly there will be points where, and even on the Information Commissioner, it will come back to an issue which could equally have fallen under something that the Children and Young People's Commissioner might have been doing. But I think in terms of some of the issues, say, for example, around about the moratorium and things, that the danger of the precedent, I think we feel, is that on those advocacy is where do you draw the line? And that's why we would distinguish, because there will be things that you can see about the workings of Parliament and workings of democracy, and the other ones it's a case of what group doesn't get. And I think it's very easy to argue for why somebody should get one, but then that basically, I think, is opening the floodgates.
Yeah. Anybody else want to come in on that?
So we were trying to capture the point that was made just about the complexity of the landscape. So the phrase special interest commissioners seeks to kind of capture within the big bowl of commissioners all the potential candidates. In our research, we found that commissioners do tend to occupy positions where there is debate and contestation about need and allocation of resource and protection of citizens' interests. But I don't think there's any special significance around the name commissioner. I mean, they've been used right back into the 19th century. One of the things that you could think about doing is, if you are going to engage in that, why are we creating a new commissioner, is actually protecting that status within Scots law, which would be one way of saying these people fall within this category, these commissioners fall within this category and they do these jobs, and the things that are outside of that category are something else.
But you also reflect, Dr. Lamont, don't you, on soft powers versus hard powers? And I mean, does that help us define the purpose of different commissions and commissioners? Because Alison Payne, you mentioned the Children's and Young Persons Commissioner and the Information Commissioner might be able to do that, or they might be interchangeable, except the Information Commissioner has got certain powers of enforcement, which the Children's and Young Persons Commissioner does not. So I don't know whether any of you want to reflect on that.
I think my example was more about the potential of there being an overlap in some of the work that they might do, but there is a difference there. And I think it would be strange to give anybody that falls into the advocacy role of that kind of those stronger powers, because then you do get into a slightly little, I would say, a democratic deficit, because if a commissioner is saying that, yes, we're going to compel this activity and the government doesn't want to enforce it, but the government's been democratically elected, what happens there? I think there is the ones that are, whether you call them integrity or not, it's about making sure democracy is working. I think if there's a difference of opinion about what should happen in terms of public services, that you have to be careful that somebody who isn't elected has a power to compel and go against where the public mood and opinion might be. And I think that's where there's a difference. You can see something that's making democracy work properly versus something that it's a disagreement on policy.
Okay. I mean, the Scottish Human Rights Commission has made a pitch for more powers, I think, including some powers of enforcement. I mean, and I guess the equivalence might be with the Equality and Human Rights Commission UK-wide, which has got power to support litigation, which itself can mount its own inquiries and so on. So they've got demonstrably more power, and yet nobody thinks that that's an interference with the due process of Parliament or government.
But I would just to come back, I'd say that is more wide-ranging. I think something like a children's and young persons or a disability or that's a sort of smaller interest group. And human rights and some of the equality commissions are looking at a broader, they are supposed to represent everybody, whereas some of the special interest groups are representing a special interest group or a small group. And so to have powers of enforcement there, where there's a democratic deficit on that, I think would undermine trust, I would say.
Okay. Let me move it on to... Oh, sorry, Dr. Gill, sorry.
Sorry, sure. I mean, I think you're right to point out that the complexities of this sort of conceptual landscape. I mean, the attempt I would make would be something like distinguishing regulators, which look across the piece checking on a system. So you've got inspectorates, the process of setting rules, enforcement, monitoring, which falls within regulation. When something goes wrong in a specific case, you might appeal to a regulator, but if you're not happy, you might go to an ombuds, and then they would be looking at casework, and they're complaints driven. A commissioner then is sort of trying to act to some extent independently of those existing systems of regulation and complaints. And I think usually is not being driven by an individual case. It's being driven by there is a systemic problem that requires a degree of independence from that system to address. And so I think from then that drives your question about, well, what powers should they have? If they're not part of the executive system, they can't necessarily do things, but they can recommend, and maybe you can consider sort of comply or explain powers, which is this point of them being able to make recommendations and expect that the other bodies that have executive power respond to them and explain what they're doing.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, we put this to the test with the Scottish Public Services Ombudsman over the case of the Waspy women, where clearly there was an Ombudsman recommendation which the government has chosen not to implement. Can I just go into a final area which is related to this? So, setting aside the enforcement part, regulation and adjudication. In some commissions, that seems to be combined. So the Information Commissioner, the Scottish Public Service Ombudsman, for example. But if we look at, for example, the Ethical Standards Commissioner and the Standards Commission in the Scottish landscape, there is a separation between regulation and adjudication. And I just wonder whether that's a unique example in your experience, or whether there are other instances where there is a separation between those two functions.
As far as I'm aware, I haven't come across anything similar. I can go away and look at that question. I think there's two different ways of looking at this. You're looking for consistency across a range of bodies that are all doing similar activities in relation to different areas of policy. That's one level. But each of those bodies, while it operates on that level, is also part of an infrastructure that is not related to that. It's about the context in which it operates. So take human rights. It's part of a much wider framework of enforcement powers, the Human Rights Act 1998, the status of the ECHR, those kind of things. So there's a role for that body within that infrastructure where it may fit. But it doesn't mean that that fit in there is consistent with what each of the others is doing. So I think there's a genuine consideration over whether if you're going to have these bodies, do you need them to be exactly the same and have exactly the same powers, or are they actually doing something different in the policy space that they're working within? But yeah, I'm happy to follow up on that.
Thank you. And finally, Ian Elliott, I'll ask you, how do you reconcile that kind of fragmentation, or that differentiation, or that right to be different with your call for a more strategic state?
Yeah, so I think part of this is about explaining to the public what the role of a commissioner is. And of course, one of the challenges is if you have different commissioners who are sponsored or funded by different bodies who have different levels of power, and some are advocacy and some aren't. It creates a very, very messy picture to the public. So having a clear sense of what is a commissioner as a starting point, I think would be incredibly helpful. Having a clear definition of what is and what isn't a commissioner, I think would be very helpful. And having some consistency over the use of language, I think would be very helpful in terms of communicating that to the public. Even having, I know there is some information on the Scottish Parliament website, but even having, you know, clearer signposting on the Scottish Parliament website about, you know, where to go if you have a complaint about a particular Scottish body or something like that, I think would be helpful. And also, you know, to go back to the earlier question, you know, this idea of having a central contact point, and again would really help to provide that focus for the public. But I think it would also help the commissioners themselves in having, you know, more of a shared understanding of what they do and being able to help to support the development of their own expertise as commissioners under one umbrella, rather than having lots and lots of different different types of body out there.
Thank you.
If you have a child, have you ever asked whether they know who the Children's Commissioner is or what they are? Because mine doesn't, and I talk about this stuff.
Okay, that's great. That's me finished, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you. Just before I move on to Ash Regan, I mean, you talked there about a definition and about, I think, good questions from colleagues about how could the landscape be made simpler and easier to understand and better structured. I mean, do you think there's a possibility that we need a Consolidation Act to bring some of this all together, reform it, strategise things so that it's more coherent? I'm just aware, particularly with the reserve legislation in years past, that there's been consolidation acts that have helped to tidy the landscape. And do you think there's maybe a need for that here in Scotland? It's quite a broad question.
Yeah, it is. No, it's good though. It's getting me thinking. Yeah, so I'm not sure legislation is necessarily needed. You know, a kind of Consolidation Act. I know that can be a kind of straight away that, you know, the first answer. Well, let's get a new act. I'm not sure that's needed. I do think there needs to be some thought given to the landscape, undoubtedly. In terms of,
I mean, I just suggest a piece of legislation because many of these commissioners have been created out of primary legislation.
Yeah. And again, you know, there's a rule for, I think, the committee structure to ask, you know, questions when these pieces of legislation are going through, and there may be ways in which the committee structure itself can be reformed, as Alison previously mentioned, to help support this a little bit more. I mean, in terms of providing a more strategic overview of the role of commissioners and their function, and indeed public bodies more generally, I keep coming back to the role of the National Performance Framework in this, because that's meant to be setting out the long-term ambition of the government and the national outcomes that the government are seeking to achieve. Now, if you have a clear sense of the national outcomes that you're trying to achieve, then I feel as though a secondary question to that is, what are the structures and the systems of government that you need in order to help deliver that? So it's almost, for me, it's part of that question, and I guess that's perhaps where some of the questions about, you know, do we need a separate commissioner to kind of advocate for the National Performance Framework, I think that's part of where those questions come in, is at the moment, that particular framework doesn't have a kind of a voice, an independent voice that's advocating for it outside of government, and so it can kind of move between directorates, can move in terms of its its level of priority in the kind of parliamentary, list of priorities. So is there a need for an independent body that provides a voice for that? And perhaps that's a way of thinking about how you actually deliver, how you actually implement the national outcomes, is what public bodies do you need in order to support that? So I'm now sort of almost suggesting another commissioner here, aren't I?
Yeah, I'm sure Sarah Boyack will be listening attentively.
She might well be, but I think there is you've raised a really important point, convener, about how the Parliament makes decisions, or indeed how the Parliament scrutinises the government in terms of the public body's landscape. As I say, I'm not convinced that there's a need for additional legislation around that, although I completely accept your point that many of these bodies have been created through primary legislation themselves. But I think there's almost a step before that, which is about reviewing the public sector landscape in Scotland and asking those questions in the context of the national outcomes. What are the public bodies that are needed in order to support delivery of those or achievement of those national outcomes?
And that's very helpful ahead of us having government in front of us in future session. And of course, I note that the Deputy First Minister has announced to Parliament just a number of weeks ago that the National Performance Framework is being reconsidered. So we'll take that into our considerations as well. So thank you very much. And that also dovetails nicely to Ash Regan to ask about accountability and scrutiny. So
sure.
Over to you, Ash.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to the panel. I think it's been an interesting discussion so far. And the committee has a strong interest, I think rightly, in the areas of accountability and scrutiny mechanisms and how they're working or not working, as you, depending on how you see it. So I'll just start. The first question is specifically for Dr. Elliott. In your written submission, you identified a number of additional reforms, including things like new funding models. I guess it was this idea of linking back to the outcomes that we're seeking to achieve. Would you like to expand a little bit on what you were thinking there?
So sorry, can you just clarify, was that specifically about funding in terms of outcomes, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, so I guess there's a question about what bodies we have to support the achievement of national outcomes and how public bodies are being held to account against their work towards national outcomes. Again, it may be that there's a need for reform of the parliamentary system itself to have a committee, a specific committee, that is scrutinising bodies against the national outcomes. There's also questions, and I know other devolved administrations and other governments internationally have looked at, how do you shift funding away from a fairly siloed approach to something that is more targeted towards thinking about delivering or achieving outcomes. At the moment, within the Scottish Government, the National Performance Framework sits within the Performance Delivery and Resilience Directorate, but then that's separate to the Exchequer Strategy Directorate. And for me, if you want to deliver national outcomes, there's an important question about how you fund that. And so there needs to be a link between the funding of public bodies and the delivery of national outcomes. So that was where that comment really came about. And again, we don't at the moment have a commissioner or an independent body, or indeed a specific committee that, although in fairness, of course, the Finance and Public Administration Committee do a very good job on this, but they have quite a broad remit. But there isn't a specific body that is looking at the extent to which the government is actually setting out to achieve the national outcomes and its performance against that. We have great ambitions, but there isn't a clarity in terms of scrutiny of the performance against those national outcomes, and that was where that comment really came from.
Okay, thank you. The next question is for Dr. Gill. So your report discusses the importance of clear responsibilities in the area of oversight. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little bit in terms of how that oversight responsibilities can be enhanced, clarified, to increase that accountability, and also, I think, to reduce duplication as well.
You're thinking of the piece of work on parliamentary oversight.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think so that report, I guess, had two angles to it. One was because it was looking across the range of regulators in the Westminster Parliament. It was identifying a kind of imbalance of interest, if you like, between there were certain regulators that were in public view or in high-profile sectors because certain things had gone wrong, which got a lot of parliamentary attention. And others which didn't. So it was trying to argue for mapping those regulators as a whole and looking at the frequency and nature of parliamentary scrutiny across the piece. Now, I know that the SPCB does an annual review of how each of the commission is performing against its objectives. And so, in a way, that is already well ahead of what the Westminster Select Committees were doing for, at least the majority of the regulations that we looked at, and that is a good thing. What might be useful from that report, though, as well, is some of the recommendations around how to engage in hearings to get the most out of a regulator, to try and encourage them to talk about future plans to meet their objectives, to focus on, for instance, looking at what their remit and objective is and whether it works, how it fits with other things. And also there's sort of suggestions in there about institutional support for parliamentary committees who are trying to scrutinise often quite technical organisations, so that there should be like a unit of if you like, specialist clerks who are able to support them to conduct that kind of scrutiny, and then making sure that you keep coming back to the same ongoing questions of performance and strategic direction, because some of the committee hearings tend to be a bit of a set piece or a one-off. So you might have a good conversation about something, but then it's not clear whether it's followed up or how it's taken forward. So it was a series of things around just trying to make that scrutiny process more impactful.
That's useful, thank you. And this one's directed to Dr. Lamont. We've obviously had a few discussions already on the committee about annual reporting and where that's working, where that's not working. So there's a suggestion here that the SPCB has the power to determine the contents of those annual reports. I'm wondering your thoughts on that. Are they meaningful enough? Is the information in there actionable enough for the parliamentary committees? What would your view be on that?
I think any annual report has to reflect against the objectives of the Commissioner, their planned activities for the period, and the extent to which they've attained those activities, so that they're responding to their statutory framework, but also to their kind of shorter term objectives. So you have that kind of narrow focus and the broader focus. Mm-hmm. In terms of scrutiny by committee, I would agree with the point made that if you're dealing with very technical areas, there does need to be some support around scrutiny of that, the point that Dr. Gill just made. But I think annual reporting is the best way of ensuring that these bodies are reflecting on their broader purpose and their short-term objectives.
But you think the content of them is appropriate? Does it need to be improved, or is it working just now?
So I have less experience of the Scottish context. Okay. But in the ones I've spent time with, there is serious engagement with the purposes and their aims within a period. There's no standardisation.
Okay.
So it's difficult to analyse across the piece, but then, as has been observed throughout, they're all doing slightly different things with slightly different powers. So consistency around that is actually quite difficult.
Okay.
Makes it harder work for you.
Yes, I think it does. Thank you. And then this is for anyone that wants to come in on this idea about measuring outcomes. I think as a committee, we're very much grappling with this idea of are we managing as a parliament to really measure the outcomes accurately in terms of what these commissions are producing, and particularly, I suppose, the advocacy-based ones. Do you think there's ways that measuring outcomes could be improved? Do you think the Parliament is managing to scrutinise them effectively in that sense? Yeah.
I think one of the challenges that we have here is the powers that the Scottish Parliament have increased dramatically since devolution. There's still the same number of MSPs. Now, I'm not sure there's public appetite for more MSPs, but it's creating a real challenge, I think it's fair to say, for the Parliament to maintain the level of scrutiny over all the activities of government.
Yeah.
And that's particularly an issue, again, with a unicameral system. The Parliament was never designed with thinking about how the electoral calculations would work out in terms of having one party dominating for such a long period of time. There was always an expectation that there would be coalitions. So the actual structure of committees and the structure of the Parliament is quite different to what was expected. Now, within all of that, I think there's a really, really crucial role for this group of independent parliamentary bodies that are there to provide scrutiny and oversight of legislation and of government to support the Parliament. And I think, as the Parliament does grow and develop and receive more devolved powers, I think that there's potentially a growing role for commissioners. The question, obviously, that we have, in front of us today is, when do you decide to have a commissioner? When do you not? What should their powers be? What should there not be? But I think there is a really, really crucial role, nonetheless, for commissioners within this Parliament, which is quite distinct from the UK Parliament, for example. And we're not as resourced as the UK Parliament, is fair to say. So there's real challenges here, and there's a real need for strong, effective scrutiny, which expert, independent commissioners can provide. And part of that is about the scrutinising the performance of government against the outcomes that it has set for itself. And it may not always be possible for the Parliament to perhaps do that. There may need to be separate bodies that are providing an independent view of how the government is performing against the objectives that it's set for itself. So I think that's where this question of national outcomes comes in. It's who is really providing that scrutiny of how the government is currently performing. And with new legislation that's coming in, is that new legislation going to actually support the achievement of national outcomes, or do we sometimes have knee-jerk reactions to events that aren't actually going to contribute to the delivery of more longer-term outcomes? So all of those questions are very much in my mind when I think about what the role is of parliamentary commissioners within the Scottish Parliament. So I do think they have a really, really crucial role to play.
Okay. Yep.
Just to coming on the back of Dr. Elliott there, I think the issue around about the number of MSPs is important. And I think, I'm not sure if it was the Conveners Committee, but I read in evidence about the lack of time in the committee timetables to be able to properly scrutinise the work of the SPCB bodies. That isn't a problem on the fault of the bodies, it's a problem on the fault of the committee system. And there is an issue there. There's perhaps a question that are we looking to create more and more commissioners because there will be public acceptance of that, whereas there's not public acceptance of additional MSPs to manage the workload. And that the scrutiny is really important. And I think that there have been, from Ken McIntosh's committee inquiry work to look at how to strengthen the committees. We have a really good committee system, but it is struggling. And with the growth in legislation, it's not able to do some of the work that it did in the early days about taking on inquiries. So I think there's perhaps looking and taking a step back. Have we ended up in this position because it's unpalatable to talk about more MSPs?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we know that capacity certainly is one of the issues that we are facing. But just to ask another question then about, I guess this comes back to the, measuring the performance of the commissions themselves. If there is a commission where it's felt that it's not complying with its remit, for instance, and it almost looks as if the Parliament either sort of fails to understand that that's part of its duty, and it isn't being, held to account in that way, or isn't being censured. Do you think that that's a failure of the parliamentarians or the Parliament in order to do that, or do you think that there is the way that that's been conceived, if you like, or set up? Maybe there's a failure in that part of it. Any views on that?
Well, it would seem to me that if there's a failure of the actual commissioner body, your levers would be either looking at the appointee in that body or looking at the legislation that gives that body its powers and remit. And so I would say it is for the Parliament to gather the facts on that and then form a view as to which of those will be the problem. If I may, I'd also say on the previous point in terms of looking at the scrutiny of performance against existing objectives elsewhere in government, you should also think about how the role of Audit Scotland lattices into this, because where the outcomes or the intended outcomes are set, and you're just able to measure performance against it, it may be that they're they could be the first port of call, or their remit might need to be slightly enlarged to give you the assurance you need on it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Lorna Slater in a second, but just following up on that, Dr. Gill, I mean, and others, do you have any thoughts on potentially whether there should be sunset clauses? For example, 5-year review of whether bodies are performing their function and still needed. So a sunset clause or a periodic evaluation. And also one of the points that's been raised through our evidence sessions in previous weeks has been the possibility of not just holding scrutiny sessions with parliamentary committees more frequently and creating the capacity for that, as Alison Payne touched on rightly, but also, would there be a benefit of a new committee dedicated to the scrutiny of SPCB bodies? Or are there other models that we should explore? So, Lorna, do you want to add your supplementary into that as well?
No, I don't want to drag it down a rabbit hole.
Okay. So I don't know if any of you have any thoughts on that, perhaps starting with Dr. Gill.
Sure. So to take the first question on periodic evaluation, I think, yes, that is a good idea to look back at the sort of fundamental remit of the body and see both whether that remit is right as well as whether it's performing against it. A formal sunset clause it can be a hostage to fortune in these situations, and I think it's important to only set these bodies up where you think that there is an ongoing role for them. But you should certainly be open to not continuing them if they're not performing a useful function. In terms of the roles of committees, I'm not sure whether a new committee, I guess the question is, would a new committee have a materially different role to the role of this committee? Or is it just that this committee's bandwidth needs to be amplified? And if it's the latter...
We have a limited timetable, Dr. Gill. We are going to be ceased in September, so we have a sunset clause. So,
okay.
So anyway, sorry to interrupt you in your flow.
Well,
just
in that case, I mean, yes, you know, and you have that with some of the sort of parliamentary bodies in Westminster, a committee that is not that can enables them to report directly to Parliament rather than through government is actually quite important. So it sounds to me as though that's likely to be necessary. But clearly, I do not have the in-depth knowledge of the Scottish system to give you a good answer.
No, it was very helpful, and excuse me for interrupting you with that point of clarity. Thanks for all that. Dr. Lamont, do you want to come in on these points?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on the point about the difficulty of assessing performance, particularly where the commissioner is influence-based or advocacy-based, whatever term you use, because you can't trace through a diffuse system very easily where an opinion expressed, a report, whatever it may be, has impacted, caused change. It's very challenging for the commissioner body to do that. If you accept that you're going to have a commissioner body that has that purpose, at that point, parliamentary scrutiny does become really important, because MSPs can have that conversation about that discussion and debate and how did it participate. If the discussion previously is much more about measurables, how you measure particular outcomes against national objectives. Yeah, so it's thinking about the purpose of the commissioner, how you scrutinise them, and then what's the role of the committee in doing that, I think.
Yeah. I just want to say I agree with what Dr. Gill said about the sunset clauses and the risk of creating a hostage to fortune. I think there's a real challenge if you're creating a new body and you're saying, well, we're only going to give you 3 years or 5 years. You know, who's going to want to take that on with the idea, well, you know, this is something that's not going to exist potentially after 5 years. So I think that is a very good point and worth noting. But at the same time, that doesn't exclude the need for continual review of all of the commissioner bodies, and I'm sure they would welcome that themselves. So long as that doesn't become politicised, you know, because these bodies do operate a function of scrutinising government. So it's important that, you know, if a particular commissioner is being perhaps quite critical over the way a particular policy has been developed, or whatever, that doesn't then come back to bite them in terms of some sort of review process or evaluation process. But of course, you know, all public bodies should be subject to you know, evaluation and scrutiny themselves. But the idea of creating a sunset clause, it feels quite kind of harsh, almost in a way, to say, right, we're going to set this, and it suggests a lack of confidence. You know, if you really felt it was necessary to create a body, why would you say on the outset, well, it's really, really important that we have this body, but maybe only for 5 years, or maybe only for 3 years, or whatever? I think, you know, I would be surprised if anyone would suggest that the Information Commissioner might not be needed in 3 years' time. You know, I mean, it serves such an important function, and if we're not absolutely confident in the purpose of the Commissioner, then, you know, then I think you need to look at something else. You need to look at a different model. You know,
of course, quite considerable sunk cost in setting up a body as well. So. Lorna Slater, do you still want
might
to,
take us down a
covered?
rabbit hole, convener. I think maybe I'll leave it with you.
Okay, thank you. So I have a final set of questions. One is there anything that you wanted to say today that you haven't had the chance to emphasise to us in questioning so far. And also, as a last point of sharing your insights and knowledge, which have been extremely helpful. If you were in our shoes, if you were tasked with what we've been asked to do by Parliament, is there anything that you would definitely do that we'd be really interested to know your thoughts? So, Alison, do you want to go first?
I think, I mean, we've said in our written evidence that we support the sort of the moratorium that the Finance Committee suggested on certain new bodies. Obviously, some are already passed legislation, some are on their way through, and it's very easy to say, well, let's have a moratorium, but by the way, these ones are already going to be created. So it kind of, I think we almost need to kind of intervene and say, well, although we've passed the patient safety one that we're working our way through, I think there needs to be, and the committee system is brilliant for this because it's the cross-party representation of it, to actually be able to come together and say, look, we need to stop this. It's not that we are necessarily, we need to take a pause, we need to look at things across the board and widen it out from just the sort of narrow focus on the SPCB protected bodies, but what is it about, whether it's our committee system, if our committees aren't able to properly scrutinise existing bodies, what impact is it going to be to create new ones? What are those bigger issues? And I think that, yes, there are unpalatable issues around about MSP numbers and workload and other such things, but I think if we could, it would be nice if we could take the sort of the kind of the toxic politics thing out of it, come together and say, this is a problem, we need to work together on a solution that makes our democracy work better, because I think it's very easy to actually just keep creating these bodies. It's a nice win for somebody. Of course, it's a very difficult thing to explain to the electorate why you might be voting against what's now passed to say, the Old People's Commissioner. That's a hard thing to explain why you would be voting against it. So you can see how more and more would get passed unless there is that sort of cross-party buy-in and sort of say, look, this is where we are. We need to strengthen our committee systems. We need to strengthen that kind of how we scrutinise what's going on in government, and the broader points about the national performance framework and outcomes are clear, but that goes across the public sector. And a solution to those scrutiny issues shouldn't be to create more and more of these bodies. It should be to look internally and see how we can fix things. And that might bring up uncomfortable conversations about MSP numbers and such. But as Dr. Elliott said, the Parliament's massively increased its powers. Mm-hmm. We should be having committees that are able to look at in depth, carry out the inquiries, really advocate for individuals. And I think that sort of broader issues around about how the Parliament is working need to be considered rather than looking just at the SPCB bodies in isolation. I think it needs to be part of a broader conversation.
Well said. Dr. Gill?
If I was in your shoes, I would do two things. The first of them you may well already been doing, which is thinking about what the replacement structure is for this committee. And I guess that would be starting by identifying what it is that Parliament has to do in order to oversee these bodies, and that cannot be delegated somewhere else. So I would delegate whatever oversight is possible to Audit Scotland, to other bodies as appropriate, and then identify how Parliament's going to conduct the remaining oversight, which might be about the legislative basis and objectives, the relationships the bodies have with government, Parliament, and issues of public interest. What I would then do is, and it's already come up in the conversation, is really hone in on those criteria as to why a commissioner specifically should exist rather than any other structure to solve a problem. What kind of underrepresented interests or requirements of independence it has, and also what they are not for, so that there's almost like an exclusion list of kind of things people often propose commissioners for, which are not the right answer, which sort of excludes them. And I'd be then very cautious about how that list expands. But I'd start with the criteria as your kind of yardstick for determining that.
Thank you, Dr. Lamont?
I think in terms of this committee's role, it's really important to emphasise that these questions are not just questions that the Scottish Parliament is grappling with. So if you look across, developed legal systems, they are all grappling with difficulties of accountability, representativeness, scrutiny, and public engagement, I think. And commissioners feature across many different jurisdictions. So I've talked mostly about England and Wales because that's what I know the best. But Canada has a victims framework and a human rights commissioner. In Australia, they have a much broader range of commissioners, including e-safety commissioners. So this is not a problem that is unique to Scotland. However, the constitutional significance of where these commissioners sit and how you scrutinise them and what purpose they serve within the Scottish constitutional framework is a reflection of devolution and changing powers in Scotland and how you ensure that Scottish citizens can access support that they need, they are represented in different environments, and that the Scottish Parliament can scrutinise them. So I think it's worth putting that in that broader context and saying that some of these bodies have very comparable bodies abroad, and that's part of a wider network that Scotland's part of in that conversation. So that was the only point that I wanted to make in addition.
Thank you. Thank you. Again, very helpful. And last, Dr. Elliott.
Thank you. Yes, really agree with everything that's been said. I was really struck by particularly what Alison was saying about, the potential incentives to create new commissioners when you're developing a piece of legislation, and how that can be seen as a kind of quick win almost, and also something that can be quite difficult to argue against. So, older people's commissioner was mentioned, patient safety commissioner. Very, very difficult to argue that that you're against older people or you're against patient safety, and so there are incentives almost within the system to develop new commissioners. That has all sorts of challenges in terms of how they are resourced, in terms of potential overlap with existing commissioners. I do think there needs to be some additional process within the Parliament through the committee structure to approve new commissioners, some way of having greater oversight of the number of commissioners that we have, their roles and duties, and how they are performing. The value of having commissioners has been mentioned numerous times, and we keep coming back to the idea of them being independent. But my final comment would be, in terms of what I would do if, God forbid, I was on, in your shoes, would be that we're talking in a very, very restricted form here about parliamentary commissioners, when, as I said earlier, there are about 16 other bodies in Scotland right now that have commission or commissioner in the title that we're not discussing. And so what does that say about where the public feel that they can go? What does that say about how we understand the role of commissioners when there are so many other bodies that already exist that we're not looking at, that we're not including within this particular inquiry? So never mind the ones that are already being already going through the process of approval through legislation, but it's already such a messy landscape. I think I would be raising questions about how those bodies are scrutinised, and if we're creating almost a two-tier system where some commissioners have all of this scrutiny of them, all of this parliamentary activity around whether they're performing their duties or not, whilst there's another separate group of commissioners that don't have that same level of oversight. So those are my final thoughts. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, and thank you very much. All your final points there were most interesting in that were very interesting in that in the coming weeks we will be speaking to others about international examples of how things are done similarly and differently. There's consideration about what the next parliamentary term will look like and how it could scrutinise considerations about whether there should be commitments in 2026 party political manifestos, and also we have the government before us in the weeks ahead, and we'll be able to also ask them about the wider landscape that was spoken about. So thank you for all those concluding remarks and all of what you've relayed to us today in answer to our questions and sharing your insights and views. It's been extremely helpful for us.